just to put it into perspective, it's where I started, acid-base homeostasis and bone. And for 20 years, really, or 15 years, worked in that area. And it's an incredibly difficult area to get funded. You know, here in the United Kingdom, we were successful with some funding, and then that dried up. And as academics will know, once your funding dries up, you've got to think laterally and move to where the funding is. And so I made the switch, but half of me is still in the acid-base camp, and I'm so delighted. Helen Lambert will be speaking this afternoon on acid-base and bone, and has done the first ever meta-analysis on potassium salts and bone, for which Linda was a great co-I of ours, and Helen went on a Women's Hour and has brought back, I think, through her very hard work, the whole theory around acid base and bone. And so whilst I still thought about that, and I still do really believe that there is something in the acid base homeostasis story and the Paleolithic diet, my switch has been for the last 10 years on vitamin D, and so it's lovely to just share some of that with you. I would never call myself a vitamin D expert, and I would never call myself, for that fact, an acid-base homeostasis expert. I've just learned and read as I've gone along, and so all of you young nutritionists in the audience, you know, read. Once you read, you learn. Go and listen, you know, to the speakers, and you'll pick up so much as you go through your careers. Vitamin D, I would say I have been really astounded. It was a good switch to make. In fact, we've had 12 years of uninterrupted funding on vitamin D, which I'm very pleased, you know, that has happened. And I have come to really appreciate that actually vitamin D is really critical. It is so much more important than I had ever appreciated in my student days, and having learned it in the way that I've had to learn it to try and get some funding in it. It really is, we've always considered it to be critical for bone, both rickets, of course, in children, as you will see here, in terms of the knock knees and the bandy bow legs. And of course, in adults, once the growth plates have fused, of course, osteomalacia, which is incredible bone pain, muscle lethargy, you know, a whole fatigue syndrome in its own right, and then, of course, osteoporosis, fracture risk. But vitamin D goes far wider than just bone, and I think it's now been established that it really is important to all these different nutrients. And as I put here, wintertime is a huge challenge for vitamin D health in areas of northern latitude, and I think it is something that we haven't appreciated. And of course, as we've gone through the evolution, we've migrated north. You know, when humans began, we were so close, you know, to the sun. We had so much abundance of sunshine. And now, of course, as we have migrated north over so many years, that actually the winter time is an incredible challenge for the body. And I've come to really appreciate that over time, that vitamin D is really quite a nutrient in its own right, whilst, you know, I still believe there is really a story there in acid base. And I said to Linda, you know, it'll probably be in about 50 years' time that people actually wake up and realise that actually acid base health, or maintaining acid base homeostasis, is really key. So we're in the early days, but you know, it's lovely to get such good speakers here and to really try and plant those seeds in your minds. Now, in terms of, and I'm just going to just double check on my timings here. So when we think about it in terms of vitamin D, of course, when you look around the world, there are huge areas of vitamin D deficiency, not least. And I've spent 10 years now working with the King Abdulaziz University in Saudi Arabia, of which I would say 100% of women are, I wouldn't even call them deficient, they are severely deficient because, of course, their clothing blocks out vitamin D manufacture. There is still no food fortification or public health policy in the Middle East for vitamin D deficiency, but there are also other countries, you know, for whom are really affected. So really trying to put it onto the global system. In the UK, of course, and I put this up to just say we have been the last European country to come up with a recommendation for vitamin D, but I'm so pleased to say it's coming, so watch this space. It should be the week after the EU referendum, but we haven't yet had actual confirmation of that, so just I think the government is too busy, tied up with other things to give us the green light to go with this, but I've had the great privilege to have sat on the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition. I thought I was a little too high-spirited for them many years ago, because I've been saying we're in the dark ages for vitamin D requirements in the UK and we really need to do something about it. But we've spent 4 years really looking at, you know, what is absolutely key, I think, for the United Kingdom. So it will be out in the summer, but it'll either be straight after the EU referendum or in September. But what is absolutely the case is that it will no longer be zero. So here we have the Institute of Medicine's recommendations for vitamin D, which are, as you will see, around 15 micrograms. They were 5, and then in 2010 they tripled that to 15. As I put here, the new European, so the EFSA, European Food Standards Agency recommendations have been released for consultation, and they mirror the US recommendations, so they will be 15. SACN has gone a little lower, but whilst it's lower, it is still a 10-fold increase on where we were. So the new recommendations will be 10 micrograms, which represents a huge challenge to us in the UK. And I think the 15 represents a huge challenge to Europe, but particularly in the UK, because we currently have no food fortification policies for vitamin D, and you would achieve no more than about 3.5 micrograms or 140 international units per day. So there is a very significant shortfall of how that will be achieved, and I think that's going to be, you know, a real challenge for us in the UK, as it will be in Europe, to get up to those levels. What I would say for vitamin D is that it is a very unusual nutrient. In fact, it's a misnomer. Vitamin D is not a vital amine. It is a prohormone, and your main source is not one of diet, but is actually UVB exposure. And that UVB exposure must be with this wavelength. So in the UK and in other areas of northern latitude, we can only make vitamin D between April and September. And if we look at the mechanisms, this is a little better than that other slide, how critical UVB exposure is to allow us to make pre-vitamin D, and then through a temperature dependent isomerization onto full vitamin D. Then there is further conversion in the liver to give us 25-hydroxylase, or that's the enzyme. What we then produce is 25-hydroxy vitamin D, and that is our clinical indicator of status. And that is very useful because we can look at that or take a blood sample and measure and look to see where somebody sits for their vitamin D status. What is really key also is that 1-alpha hydroxylase converts the enzyme in the kidney, converts that 25 to 125, which is of course the active hormone of vitamin D, and it is this that makes it so critical to health. The active hormone, the 125 hormone, it makes it such that it goes so much wider than just bone. I think the other thing to just say on here is UVB exposure, so there must be a direct contact of UVB rays onto the skin. If there is clothing, that will of course block it out. So women who dress for cultural style will have much lower vitamin D levels, that's a fact. Older people who don't tend to go out, or when they do, they cover up because they feel the cold more, is also a big issue. So the elderly have very low vitamin D levels. And of course, I think the other thing to say is sun cream use. And there has been such a concern, and an understandable concern, when you look at the rates of skin cancer incidence, that there has been very much an encouragement for always to put on sun cream as soon as you are out in the sun, and particularly for children. And I think there has been trying to be some balancing between what dermatologists recommend and what rheumatologists would say, is that you need a little bit of time in the sun with no sun cream to make some vitamin D. And the body, of course, is very clever, that actually you can never become vitamin D toxic through UVB rays, because after about 20 to 30 minutes, that vitamin D, that pathway will shut off, and that's it for the day. So if you're silly enough to sit in the sun for 8 hours and allow your skin to burn, thinking you're going to really get high vitamin D levels, you won't. It'll cut off after about 20 to 30 minutes. So it makes it very, very important that on a daily basis during those April to September months, that you allow yourself 10, 15, 20 minutes a day to be out with some of your skin exposed to sunlight, not in any way allowing your skin to burn, but encouraging yourself to do that. And the dermatologist would call that incidental sun exposure. But then, of course, put on that sun cream. What's very difficult, and in that second recommendation, we did not give a recommendation of how much sunlight exposure you should have, and the IOM American board also did not, because it is so difficult. We think measuring diet is difficult. We're trying to come up with a recommendation given differences in skin tone, body surface area, all of those different aspects make it very difficult to make a recommendation. But we should, because it's a very natural way, and indeed as how we have, through evolution, of course, we used to have an abundance of sunlight exposure, and we don't now do that. And as our skins have become whiter, that has been an issue. And of course, what is key is that 125 and vitamin D play such a critical role in calcium homeostasis. And the body will absolutely ensure that we do not get into a hypo or hypercalcemic effect. And vitamin D is very important, a nutrient within that. Now, I've said quite a lot about sunshine exposure. The best way of telling whether you're in the right sunlight is that your shadow has to be shorter than your height. So I always say that to my students and try and encourage them to measure their shadows. Now, we were given some funding by the Food Standards Agency to really try and address the whole issue around the interaction between diet and sunlight exposure. And the reason that we were given that money was because the zero recommendation, so the recommendation in the UK has been that we need no vitamin D in your diet, because you make enough during the summer to last us during the winter. And so we were given some funding, as were Aberdeen, and we mirrored their study. Dr. Helen MacDonald was the PI on the Aberdeen part of this study. We mirrored their study design. And then Professor Kevin Cashman and Professor Mairead Kiley from the University College Cork had the third vitamin D funded project from the Food Standards Agency. And that evidence was used to show to government that actually that zero is wrong. And so it was a study that we took with great sincerity, and what we showed was that there was extensive low vitamin D levels, especially in our South Asian population, and that helped us to lead on to more funding and inform both Department of Health and Public Health England. And these are the results. So we measured women, younger and older, South Asians here, and younger and older Caucasians here every season for 1 year. And we started in the summer of 2006 and we finished in the spring of 2007. Now, there has been a great deal of controversy as to what is the optimum level of vitamin D status that we should be aiming to achieve. The IOM have set theirs at 50 nanomoles per litre. SACN has set it at 25 nanomoles per litre, but that is a level that is set at an individual level. So that 10 micrograms will ensure that everybody in the population is above 25 nanomoles per litre, whereas the IOM recommendation is a population mean. But what you will see is that the Caucasian women were below 50 nanomoles per litre during the winter, and this is the largest longitudinal study that we have been able to find on South Asians, and as you will see, they are almost below that line for the entirety of the year. And we were really quite astonished at how low the South Asians were for their vitamin D status. What was also very interesting, we measured a whole range of other bone and muscle indices, and I've just pulled this one out in terms of grip strength because it really caught our eye, is that the older South Asian women had the same muscle strength. I beg your pardon, the younger South Asian women had the same muscle strength as the older Caucasian women. And again, that's not been shown before, and I think is really quite concerning in terms of their overall health. What I noticed when we did the study, we had started it in 2006 and the weather was very, very warm, and of course we were then measuring spring 07 vitamin D levels. And what we then found was that we stopped the study because the funding finished, and the summer of 07 was very, very wet. And I went to the Met Office to get some statistics on this, and there was 3 times as much rainfall between this summer and a year later. And so we wrote to the Food Standards Agency and said, if you give us a little bit more money, we could measure vitamin D levels in the spring of 2008. So we could really ask that question, how important is a British summer in comparison to the subsequent vitamin D levels? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've never been in the situation where the British weather has played a role in my getting a grant extension, but it was very welcome. And we did the analysis and it made no difference whatsoever, which I really didn't think that we would find, but it didn't matter how warm the previous summer was. The subsequent spring levels were just as low. And I think that really made us realise that actually that zero, that you make enough vitamin D in the summer to last you during the winter, is completely wrong. So we were then we presented that to the Department of Health and to SACN and to the Food Standards Agency, and we then wrote a proposal to a further government funder, the BBSRC, the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, to really answer the question, okay, what about vitamin D? You get 2 forms, vitamin D2, which is your plant source, and vitamin D3, which is your animal source. And I've put there, mushrooms are a very good source of vitamin D, but not butter mushrooms. They have to be wild mushrooms because butter mushrooms are grown in the dark. So I don't know if I've got any mushroom lovers in the audience, but it's got to be wild mushrooms, or indeed before you eat them, during the summer, put them out on the windowsill for 20 minutes and you will increase the vitamin D content in your mushrooms because they are a yeast derivative, or they respond to UVB exposure. So you will get a higher vitamin D content, but it is D2. And this really picked up my eye because so much of the scientific world was saying that it didn't matter whether you gave D2 or D3. They gave the same change in vitamin D status. And so we managed to get some funding, and what we've shown, and this is now sitting and is out for review with the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, was that vitamin D3 was 50% better at raising vitamin D levels. And that was a really great result, because so many people had said, indeed 2 of the reviewers when they reviewed this grant said, actually, there's a new study out that shows that it doesn't matter which one you give. And we managed to get over that, and they gave us this funding. There are your 2 sources. D2 is ergocalciferol, which is derived from the UV irradiation of ergostrol that is widely distributed in plants and other fungi, which is why mushrooms are such a good source. And then cholecalciferol, which is your the D3, which is formed from the action of UV irradiation on the skin. So that is the form that we make in the skin, but it's also found in fish and eggs and other animal products. And so this was the study that we ran. We had Caucasian women and South Asian women, and we randomized them into 5 groups. They had a juice and a biscuit every day for 12 weeks, and that was either in a D2 matrix or a D3 matrix. And we were trying to look at not just D2, D3 differences, but whether it made a difference if you put it into a solid or a liquid form. These were the baseline results, and we were very pleased that we had no differences in any of the groups at baseline, particularly weight and BMI, which is always an issue. People with a larger BMI will have lower vitamin D status, and there were no differences in blood pressure at baseline. So we'd really got a very good match. And here are the results, that D3 was so much better than D2. You can see there, the dotted line represents the juice matrix, the solid line represents the biscuit, and it didn't matter what matrices you gave it in, which I think has been very helpful to the food industry, not just thinking about which form of vitamin D, but actually matrices. It's well absorbed. These are the actual findings, and what I'd like to just point you to is something what I think is as important as our finding, and that is our South Asians started off so much lower than our Caucasians, but then look how much those who were in the placebo group dropped during the winter. And when we have got this published, and it's taken us a little bit of time because we were trying to get the New England Journal of Medicine to take it, and I had a very interesting tete-a-tete with their editor because they have published in a review that D2 and D3 are the same, and I felt that they had a responsibility to publish this, but I lost the battle, and so we've gone to AJC, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that they will take it. But once it is out, we will then be writing a paper to say that there should be, from here on in, no more placebo-controlled trials in South Asians, because I think it's unethical. They dropped so low, 18, 19. We feel conscious of that, but we hadn't taken them off vitamin D supplements. So that sits with our conscience, and we've made sure to write to them through their GPs to let them know how low their vitamin D levels were. But I think from here on in, there should be no more placebo-controlled trials for vitamin D in South Asian populations, because they are just simply too low. And whilst there has been a lot of controversy, in fact, almost not far short of a war in the vitamin D field, as to what level of vitamin D that you should achieve, I don't think there is a single scientist anywhere that would not dispute that to be below 25 nanomoles per litre is a no-no for health. And then these are the figures here. Let's just, in the interest of time, just go to percentages. Absolutely, the Caucasian women lost or reduced in vitamin D status, but nowhere near to the extent the South Asians did. But then when you look at it in terms of D2 and in terms of D3, D3 was so much better. So to say it doesn't matter which one you give is just wrong. But what I would also say is that D2 worked. And I think, you know, it's just marrying up which one you want, and of course D2 is the plant source. and therefore very relevant for vegans, and a number of our South Asian women, I think, would prefer a plant source, than an animal source. So either D2 or D3 would work from a food fortification, but you can't say that they're the same because they're not. And where I think that it is very important, if you think about that IOM recommendation of 15 nanomoles per litre, when you start with a very low vitamin D status, as we saw in our South Asians, but the levels we were seeing would not be unusual in an osteoporosis clinic or other clinics, and you give D2 or you give D3, D2 did not achieve them after 12 weeks to above 50 nanomoles per litre, but D3 did, and it made no difference from that point of view. If you have a higher vitamin D status, yes, D3 is better, but you're above that level already. And so where that cutoff point sits is one of controversy, and I think there are some who would say, particularly from an evolution point of view, that our ancestors were used to levels at 150 nanomoles per litre. But that was achieved through UVB exposure, not necessarily their diet. And I think that's certainly something to think about, is that there is evidence of vitamin D toxicity. You have to be at very, very high levels, I have to say. But it's not as simple to say that vitamin D is not an issue, because it used to doing that. We are designed as humans to have a very steady state of vitamin D. And as we've migrated north over the years and years that have gone by, our vitamin D levels go up and down. And that really caught my eye, because it made me think about our DEFINE study. That's the first study that I showed you, that we could really look at that. We could really look at seasonal variations. And so I wrote to him and said, right, we're going to really test this, and we hope you're going to be a co-author with us, and let's really see if there is something in there, that if you have a large seasonal fluctuation, if you're a high cycler of vitamin D, which is what he's saying, that is not good for health, because you go very high in the summer and very low in the winter, as opposed to somebody who doesn't fluctuate so much. And so we measured it in our defines, and what we showed was actually, Andrea Darling did this work, that there was a link that greater seasonal cycling of vitamin D is associated with increased PTH and increased bone resorption. Now, that's only one study and we need more, but I think it certainly makes us look at that when we recommend vitamin D, maybe what we should be recommending is a wintertime supplement only. Because if you give it all year, then all you're doing is making that graph, go up and up even more. We have some further ongoing studies. Actually, I've skipped one there. Just to say, I've done a lot of work in the Middle East. It's the hardest environment of all to work in, but they're wonderful collaborators, and we're really trying to get them to appreciate, just how important vitamin D is. Professor Mohammed Adawi has done a lot in the King Abdullah Aziz University to really take that forward. And this was some data that we collected in women who were fully veiled and wore gloves, and look at their vitamin D levels. They were all very low, but it was absolutely the lowest in women who really do dress for cultural style. Now, we have further studies ongoing. We were very fortunate to be part of the very large EU project that's run by Professor Mairead Kiley and Professor Kevin Cashman from University College Cork. And so we've just finished a randomised control trial, which is also currently sitting with AJC and with Taryn Smith as the PhD student on that. And then over the last 15 years, I've done a lot of work with the military. They were very slow to start. I think it took me about 8 years to persuade them to do something. And now once you get the might of the British military behind you, there's no stopping you, and I can't keep up with them. But what we're doing are 2 studies, which we're really proud of. This is the first one, which is in British submariners. So we have data now on about 300 submariners, and it's the largest study in the world. It's the study that we would never get ethical approval for, to lock people away for for 12 weeks. But that study has started, and we're really looking at, and indeed the study has finished, but I can't reveal any results at the moment because it currently sits with Surgeon General himself, but there will undoubtedly be changes in the recommendations that are currently given to submariners, not just in this country. I think we will share the data, with other countries to really try and improve the health of submariners as they spend so long, down there. And we had 4 submarines. Submarines are called boats, not ships. I've already made that mistake in a military environment. And that they even allowed us to have our own freezer on the submarine. And Surgeon Captain Mike Lindsay, who's doing his PhD with myself and Professor Bruce Griffin and Dr. Martin White, has collected that data, and we're getting that out for publication in due course once we get sign-off from the military. And then the second study that we're doing is we followed 1,200 Royal Marines for a year, and we looked at their vitamin D levels, and we looked to see if there was a cut-off point below which you were more likely to have a stress fracture. And we found there absolutely was. Below 16 nanomoles per litre in this military cohort, you were more likely to fracture. So Dr. Joanne Fallowfield, who's the head of applied physiology at the Institute of Naval Medicine, who is well, a bit like Linda, I can't keep up with her. She's just such a lady that thinks ahead of her time. Through her headship at INM unit there in applied physiology, we've persuaded the military to run the first ever randomised control trial on vitamin D in 5,000 Royal Marines. So we've done the pilot study, we're just analysing that at the moment, and then the big study will run until 2020. And it's really to look at, it's powered for stress fracture prevention, but it's also to look at functions of upper respiratory tract infections, because that is as big an issue in the military as stress fractures are. And so we're just getting that underway, and we hope that it will prove to be, a very, very useful study indeed. Now, it wouldn't be without my just saying we have I've had the tremendous privilege to have supervised, I'm up to number 22 now, of PhD students. They've all got through or are all currently getting through, and it's what keeps me so enthusiastic and ticking, is to work with such fabulous young brains. And I just, a number of these are in the audience. I've said about Andrea Darling's work. Laura Tripkovic is the lead author on the D2, D3 study. Dr. Louise Wilson, who's just got her PhD by just over a month, was very much part of the D2, D3 study and really led on the genetic work. And then PhD students, Taryn Smith, who I've mentioned, but also Saskia Wilson-Barnes, who's doing a lovely study looking at vitamin D in physically active university athletes and non-athletes, and is with us, and Marcela Mendes, who comes to us from Brazil as part of the Science Without Borders. So I've got a wonderful group. I have to say I'm losing one of the brightest brains. Louise Wilson is off to a fabulous job as Science Director of Yakult, but she and Laura, I call the dream team. We did an absolutely amazing study on D2, D3, and we wouldn't have done it without those two. And of course, Dr. Helen Lambert, who you will hear this afternoon on what she has done as a senior research fellow here at Surrey. And she was in Sheffield, and Sheffield's loss is Surrey's gain. And so with that, I will stop, and thank you very much for your attention. Yes.
So are you saying that in a day, in 24 hours, you will only absorb up to 20 to 30 minutes of vitamin D? Is that right?
Yes, from UVB exposure. Obviously, you will get it in through your diet,
but going out in the sun.
Yes, you won't. It's very difficult. In some people, they will be able to absorb a little bit more, and for some people, it will be shorter than that. But I spent about a year for the National Osteoporosis Society trying to be the mediator between rheumatologists and dermatologists to try and come up with an agreement. And I think it was probably about 20 to 25 minutes with about 10% of your body exposed. So that would be your face, your neck, the backs of your hands would allow you to get some vitamin D. So I would encourage that very much, that during those summer months, to allow your body to get some vitamin D from UVB exposure, because the body is adjusted to that. That's how, through evolution, we used to obviously go around with far less clothes on us and in much hotter weathers.
Because one of the things I say to some of my ladies that have the veil is, have they not got an area that they can go that is not overlooked and just go in the sun just for about 10 to 15 minutes? A lot of them do, so I'll try and get them to do that as well.
Yes,
But that was really interesting that you actually were saying that time frame, because
it would be, and I would honestly say that women who dress for cultural style, and having worked as I have worked in the Middle East, with a fantastic team out there, I would honestly say vitamin D supplement is absolutely, because they are covered up, so they are not getting out. There.
Thank you so much.
And one more question there.
Is it,
Now we have to
just a
close.
quick one, is that a 24-hour turnaround, or is it more than that?
No, it would be around about, the half-life of 25 OHD is about 28 days, which is no wonder why it then doesn't last us, during, for the summer and into the winter. But yes, on a daily basis, I think an individual, it's different in different people, but I think if one gets into the habit that on a daily basis that you're trying to get out there, which you will do, you'll go to the shops, you'll go, which is what the dermatologist would call incidental sun exposure, which is why it is such an issue in where you are covered up.